Okay, so I'll answer the two biggest questions that I receive here at the White House, and that is, yes, I do watch Little Two Fools on Reactivation. Come on, man, you know the thing. And no, I'm I'm not a lizard.
Reactivation. Reactivation. Reactivation.
Yeah. Let's go, Daddy.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another reactivation video.
Things that used to be common, but now are considered horrible.
Whoa, things that are now considered horrible. We better go ahead and put in our disclaimer. We don't agree or disagree with anything that might be common or considered now horrible.
The title clearly says it used to be common, but now it's considered horrible.
Let's get into this guy and see what he's talking about. This is Sideprojects. Go check out the channel. He's got a lot of followers.
Yeah.
Check him out.
The times, they are a-changin', and generally this is a good thing, as the past, as everybody knows, was the worst. But if you are an utterly despicable human being, then perhaps you might have just liked the past better. Sure, you wouldn't have access to all of life's modern conveniences, but there's a whole lot of stuff that used to be extremely common that is now considered horrible, if not being downright illegal.
Oh, great. Here we go.
Surprisingly, cannibalism is not illegal in the vast majority of the world. Idaho is the only state in the United States that has an actual law against the practice, and most countries don't bother to impose restrictions on it at all. Even today, there's one common act that is technically cannibalism: eating the placenta after childbirth. Which is so weird. This is performed by up to 30% of mothers after giving birth. No.
30%?
Of course, that's not what most people think of when they think cannibalism. They're thinking of chopping up a human into some fine steaks and grinding up the rest for burgers. While this may not be illegal in and of itself, you'd be hard-pressed finding a legal way to acquire that human meat. Murder and grave robbing are still illegal, so unless you plan to eat your own flesh, there are very few options for a person to legally obtain human meat. But regardless of the legality of the whole thing, cannibalism is considered completely reprehensible. One of the most famous examples is the Donner Party in the 1800s. The survivors were reviled for their engagement in cannibalism, though only half of the survivors did so. It was considered such a taboo that a dozen members of the party opted to die of starvation rather than to consume human flesh. Despite this, cannibalism actually used to be extremely common. Based on archaeological findings, it has been determined that for people in the Paleolithic age, at least 10% of their protein came from other humans. For a solid couple of 100,000 years, cannibalism was the societal norm rather than the exception. Even as society progressed and our ability to maintain livestock removed the necessity for eating one another.
So, what he didn't mention is that soccer team who ate the people who died around them back in the 80s in the Andes. Do you remember that? We were kids.
The airplane.
Yeah.
They crashed in the Andes.
So, just like the Donner Party, they...
Yeah, it's famous.
8 people.
Yeah.
But he kind of didn't mention it, and I don't know if a lot of people...
He might. You never know.
Yeah, he might. And
people still engaged in cannibalism for religion.
I don't know if a lot of people remember that.
I'm sure there's a movie on it and all that.
Just all spiritual reasons.
Yeah,
if you were sad that a relative passed away, why not just consume part of their body so that they can live forever inside you? Or maybe you just felled a mighty warrior in battle and wanted to steal their power Highlander style. So, well, it's just best if you eat their harm to absorb all of their strength. That's not how science works, but that didn't stop this from happening less than 200 years ago in Tita Kawaru's war in New Zealand. Even though eating humans isn't any more dangerous than eating any other red meat, as long as you don't eat the brain, and even though it was a major part of society for hundreds of thousands of years, it's unlikely that we're going to see a mainstream return to cannibalism, which is probably for the best.
Let's hope. Soylent Green, though.
First cousin marriage.
In much of the world, marrying your first cousin is thought of as disgusting and incestuous. Despite this, in most places it isn't actually illegal. Less than half of the states in America completely outlaw it, and it is legal in nearly all of Europe. It is actually East Asia that has the strictest laws regarding cousin marriage, with South Korea banning it all the way out to third cousins. Though the practice remains predominantly legal since the mid-1800s, there has been a dramatic decrease in the prevalence of cousin marriage. It was around that time that Western society came to the belief that cousin marriage was immoral and incestuous, probably the result of the genetic deformities that plagued royal families. However, in some parts of the Middle East specifically, a first cousin is still seen as the ideal partner for marriage. Even where this is the case, the rates at which it occurs are steadily declining, just at a slower pace than the rest of the world. But until the 1800s, cousin marriage, and especially first cousin marriage, was extremely common. It was so common that it is widely believed that over 50% of all marriages throughout human history were between first or second cousins, and some research indicates that that number may be as high as 80%. Even today, roughly 10% of marriages worldwide are between first or second cousins.
Open immigration.
Immigration is a hotly contested topic in much of the world. How many immigrants should be allowed, where they should be allowed from, and many other questions are highly polarizing topics that every country has to deal with on their own. While some countries have extremely simple and lax policies for becoming a citizen, there is currently no country in the world that has an open border policy. But that wasn't always the case, and one of the most notable exceptions was the United States. During the 18th and 19th centuries, up until the time following the Civil War, America had an almost entirely open immigration policy. The United States is the fourth largest country in the world, with a total land area equal to that of nearly all of Europe. In order to properly occupy all of that land and claim it as their own, America opted to not only have open immigration, but to actively seek immigrants so that they could maintain control over that land. Given the world is now devoid of open borders and many nations have rather stringent rules in place for immigrating to their country, it's almost unimaginable to think that for nearly half of America's history, the country had a completely open border. Somewhat ironically, the inscription on the Statue of Liberty was written in 1883, the year after Congress enacted its first immigration laws.
Here we go.
It hopefully goes without saying in modern times, but domestic violence is a bad thing. However, this rather obvious realization is an extremely new development. For most of human history, domestic violence was not only common, but legal. Many sources often cite the rule of thumb, claiming that it was legal for a husband in the 1800s to beat his wife so long as the instrument he used was no thicker than his thumb. Now, this isn't actually true, and the phrase rule of thumb dates back to at least the 1600s, when craftsmen would use their thumbs as a quick means of measuring things, relying more on experience than actual science. But this false origin story persists because it sounds completely believable given what we know about society in the 1800s. With how common and acceptable violence against women was considered to be, it seems perfectly reasonable to accept the claim at face value. Unfortunately, the reality is much worse, in that there weren't any laws restricting what could be done by a husband to his wife. Legal systems simply accepted domestic violence as a lawful means by which a husband could exercise his authority over his wife, aka his property. The first law to protect people from domestic violence didn't come until 1641 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unfortunately, this was revoked by King Charles II in 1684. It would be over 300 years before the next real laws against domestic violence were put into place, beginning in the 1990s. Though much of the Western world created their laws in quick succession, there are some countries whose laws against domestic violence are less than a decade older. Even worse, despite heavy pressure from the international community, there is still a large percentage of the world's population living in places that offer no legal protection against these despicable acts.
Over the counter. Oh, gotta be talking about methadone.
Though opium has been used since as far back as 3400 BC, it wasn't until the 19th century that its chemistry was fully understood. The effects of opium were attributed to its alkaloids codeine and morphine. With scientists now armed with this new knowledge, it was time to start marketing morphine for medicinal purposes. It was used both as a painkiller and as a cure for alcohol, and opium addiction absolutely worked for curing opium addiction, though only because pure morphine was more addictive than the opium had been. But history has a tendency to repeat itself. In 1874, an English scientist first synthesized the compound known as diamorphine. His discovery went largely unnoticed, and it wasn't until 23 years later that German chemist Felix Hoffmann would again synthesize diamorphine for biopharmaceuticals. They decided to market it under the trade name of heroin to be a replacement for morphine. Heroin was available over the counter without a prescription, and its most common use was as a cough suppressant. By the time heroin was created, morphine was already a popular recreational drug. Heroin was marketed as being just as effective as morphine, but without the narcotic effects. It was also marketed as being non-addictive and was thus used as a means to treat morphine addiction.
as well.
Really? And yeah, this worked for the same reason that morphine had worked in curing opium addiction. Users were now addicted to heroin, a stronger substance than morphine. Whether it was opium, morphine, or heroin, opioids had long been legal in the United States and indeed much of the world. These were readily available for anybody to purchase and would even be given to children with coughs or sore throats. It wasn't until 1914, by which time there were 200,000 heroin addicts in New York City alone, that the government finally stepped in and made heroin available by prescription only. It was another 14 years before the drug was finally outright banned. While the dangers of opioids like heroin are no secret to us now, they endured a lasting legacy as a common staple in any home's medicine cabinet. Unfortunately, pharmaceutical companies and government regulators never learned their lesson. When oxycodone began being marketed as effective as morphine but not addictive, somebody probably should have seen that as a bit of a red flag. When it comes to things that used to be omnipresent but everyone now knows are terrible, well, slavery is probably the first thing that comes to mind. The earliest slaves date back to at least 13,000 years ago, and for much of human history, it was incredibly common. People wouldn't think twice to see a slave auction in the town square, and even those that were morally opposed to slavery understood that it was just the way that the world worked. After all, it was the way the world had always worked. We'd like to say that the tides have turned and slavery has been all but abolished in the modern world, but unfortunately that is far from the case. Technically, every country in the world has outlawed chattel slavery. This is the form people often think of in which people can be bought and sold as property, and their offspring are also the property of the slaves' owners. Even though this is not legal anywhere, there are some countries who have decided not to actually enforce their laws against chattel slavery. But even in countries where this is illegal, modern slavery still exists in many legal forms. The two most common are bonded labor and forced migrant labor. Bonded labor, or debt bondage, is a system in which a person is given an expensive loan on the condition that they will work to pay back the debt. Essentially, they take out a loan and use themselves as collateral, conscripting themselves into slavery. The loans include extremely high interest rates and are designed such that they can never be paid off. While sometimes people do manage to pay off these debts in a few years, it is more common for the debts to instead be passed down to future generations, acting as a form of chattel slavery. Then there's the forced migrant labor, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is most common in places like the United Arab Emirates that use the kafala system. Under this system, jobs will be advertised in poorer countries like India to entice migrants to come and work for them. The advertisements offer a reasonable wage for 40 hours work a week, but once the migrants arrive, the reality is a whole lot different. These workers are forced to work as much as 18 hours per day, housed in inhumane conditions, and they'll never receive the full pay that they were promised, often not receiving any pay until 6 months after beginning the job. Under the kafala system, the employer also holds the migrant's visa, and the person is not allowed to quit or change jobs without their employer's permission, and usually not until having worked the job for at least 2 years. While nearly everybody in the world would now agree that slavery is wrong, that doesn't stop there from being nearly 50 million people living in some form of slavery today, most of it completely legal. But since slaves accounted for anywhere from 20 to as much as 50% of the total population in ancient times, we're technically making progress, right?
Wow, drinking.
Drunk driving remains far too common these days, but even those that have been guilty of it understand that it's an awful thing to do. In fact, driving while drunk has pretty much always been awful, with America's first DUI laws coming only 2 years after the Model T made cars affordable to the everyday consumer. However, those laws only applied to a person driving a car while they were already drunk. If they were still on their way to getting drunk, it was totally fine for them to be on the road. And by on their way to getting drunk, we don't mean driving to a bar, we mean a couple of beers deep with the rest of the six-pack sitting in the passenger seat. There were no open container laws and no prohibition on drivers or passengers of a vehicle consuming alcohol while the car was in motion. From beer to whiskey, it was incredibly common for drivers to take one for the road, and people didn't really think anything of it. This didn't start to change until the late 1970s and early 1980s, when society started taking motor vehicle safety more seriously. Over 20% of driving fatalities worldwide include at least one drunk driver, and most people agree that drinking and driving should not be okay. But since cars are still a relatively recent addition to civilization, it's going to take a little more time for laws to catch up with common sense. Not only does the United States have some of the most lax drunk driving laws in the world, excluding a handful of nations that have no laws against it at all, but there are even still some states in which it's legal to drink while driving so long as you don't exceed the legal limit for blood alcohol content.
Yeah, old side projects. He's got some good videos.
Yeah, he does. That was a good one.
That was a good one. That was pretty entertaining.
Yeah.
Especially the alcohol one. You gotta love stock videos, stock photos where they buy these shit.
Yeah.
To make these
well,
videos.
And
they're so tacky. B-roll shit.
It's funny because he just said that the United States has some of the most laxed.
Yeah.
And I mean,
of course we do. Of course we do.
But the legal drinking level is like 0.003 or something. I mean, it's less than one drink.
The legal drink, the point that you blow is 0.08. Yeah. Is it 0.08?
No, they lowered it. It used to be 0.08.
Anyway.
I don't know. I could be wrong. I thought they lowered it to 0.03.
So, yeah, that was a good video.
But still, it's, less than a drink for most people.
But now legalizing weed all over the country.
Yeah.
That tells you how
and they're
acceptable
legalizing psilocybin in certain places. And,
acid.
Mushrooms, yeah.
All right, guys. Thanks for sliding by. Check out another video. Till next time. Peace.
And hug someone with their permission. If you know someone.
Every time.
Every time.